Often when beginning to learn about velocity banking, it can come across as being a one-size-fits-all solution. But the reality is the strategy is not suitable for everyone, and in some cases, just simply does not make sense to use. So in today's video, we're going to go over some of the top scenarios where it likely doesn't make sense to use velocity banking. Please note, this video is in no way intended to say that no one should ever use velocity banking, but rather identifying certain situations where it can be extremely detrimental. Before we start, I will ask that if you do get some value out of this content, be sure to give the video a thumbs up and consider subscribing to the channel to stay up to date on a variety of topics related to velocity banking and everyday finance. Our first scenario where it likely does not make sense to use velocity banking is if you are someone who is already locked in at a very low interest rate. Although interest rates have gone up substantially over the past couple of years, the truth is many Americans have already locked in at much lower rates compared to the current 30-year fixed rate average, which at the time of this recording sits around 7%. According to CNBC, during the past summer, the average APR on a 30-year fixed rate mortgage was just 2.78%. This is a strong indication that many people already locked in at much lower rates compared to what we are seeing today. Of course, as the months and years go on, we should expect to see this 2.78% average rise, but that doesn't take away from the fact that many people with mortgages today have them at very low interest rates. So this is an example of a scenario where it just doesn't really seem to make a whole lot of sense to use a strategy like velocity banking to pay off a mortgage that already has a very low interest rate. And that's because when we look at the benefits of velocity banking, it is really focused on two primary benefits, which is one, paying off debt faster, and two, saving on interest. And to achieve this, we use some sort of line of credit to give us access to additional leverage. But to be able to successfully manage that additional loan, we will of course need additional capital. And whenever we're allocating additional capital to any financial strategy, there's always going to be an opportunity cost. And in the case of someone who is already locked in at a very low interest rate on their debt, whether it be a mortgage or a car loan, the opportunity cost of deploying that cash into other investments is likely going to outweigh the benefits of velocity banking. As well, with inflation staying relatively high over the past couple of months, this is something that should also be factored in when evaluating the cost of keeping debt, such as a mortgage. For example, the latest Fed data showed inflation currently sits around 3.35%. And let's imagine that I locked in my mortgage at 2.78%. So in this scenario, the real mortgage rate adjusted for inflation is approximately negative 0.57%. This negative value suggests that the mortgage rate is lower than the inflation rate, which means the mortgage is effectively cheaper in real terms after accounting for inflation. This is calculated by taking the interest rate and subtracting the inflation rate. Our next scenario where it likely does not make sense to use velocity banking is if you're someone who doesn't have an emergency fund in place. As previously mentioned, with velocity banking, we are leveraging additional capital to make a lump sum payment onto our debt. But of course, we will still need to repay the amount of that lump sum payment plus any additional interest. That's why it's extremely important to have an emergency fund in place, because what if one day there was a sudden change to my monthly income? Maybe I suddenly lose my job. Well, if I don't have an emergency fund to cover the additional obligations that I've created for myself with my line of credit, I'm likely going to have to either default on my debt, liquidate my assets, or go further into debt, putting me in a much worse place than when I started using velocity banking. Our next scenario where it likely doesn't make sense to use velocity banking is if you're someone who doesn't truly understand how the strategy works. As famous investor Warren Buffett once said, "Never invest in a business you cannot understand." And while the same principles really should be applied to any financial strategy, if you don't fully understand how velocity banking works, you can quickly become blindsided by risk and factors that you did not initially consider. Given the fact that buying a home and getting a mortgage for a lot of people is going to be the biggest investment they will make in their lifetime, it does not seem like a good idea to implement a financial strategy that could potentially harm that investment without truly fully understanding it. Our final scenario where it is likely not a good idea to use velocity banking is if you're someone who has a negative monthly cash flow. The reality is, if you have a negative monthly cash flow, you're spending more than you're making each month. And if you have a negative cash flow, your focus should really likely be on getting to a point where you're either breaking even or even better, have a positive monthly cash flow. This will then allow you to build things such as an emergency fund, which as previously mentioned is also extremely important when it comes to velocity banking. This doesn't mean that you shouldn't learn about the strategy and understand the different options out there, but rather it's just not an optimal situation to use something like velocity banking. That is all for today, but if you did find this content to be helpful, please give the video a thumbs up and consider subscribing to the channel for more content related to everyday finance and velocity banking.